First of all, before we get on to this topic and before I introduce you to my next guest, I want to say thank you to everyone behind the scenes here, because the production, the technical production, the artistic production, Walter Grond, who you've already met, these are superb people and they work incredibly hard. The levels of excellence are really unsurpassed. And also, we want to thank the interpreters, who you can't see, but they are sitting up there, and they are interpreting into German or in English, whichever language you choose to listen. We're going to be conducting this whole event in English. Now, I'd like to... Oder Deutsch. I'd like to introduce you to Nikolaj Schultz. Now, Nikolaj is a trailblazing young Danish sociologist. At Copenhagen University, his academic research is based on the implications of climate change for social theory. He's also taken up another post in architecture, which we'll talk about as well, because he has many different strings to his many different bows. Now, he teaches and has written widely on these topics and has been widely translated. Now, with the late French philosopher Bruno Latour, Nikolaj is the author of a major book called On the Emergence of an Ecological Class, which was published in 2022. And Bruno Latour died last year?
It died just after the translation of the book. Died a few months after.
Yes, well, he left behind some great work, and I know that you've been a very great friend of his and colleague. And that book was translated very widely as well. And last year, Nikolaj published Landsickness, or Landkrank in German. Now, this is a first-person, fictionalized investigation into some of the sociological and existential issues facing humanity in this era of climate change, an era which has been called, not least by Nikolaj and Bruno Latour, an era of eco-anxiety. Now, a very brief summary of the book goes something like this. A young man is sick with anxiety over the climate crisis. He doesn't call it that, but it is. How it affects him, his mind, and his surroundings. In order to escape the heat in Paris, where we find him at the beginning of the book, he travels to an idyllic Mediterranean island, a small French island, which we'll hear about, where the consequences are just as dire. His experience raises existential questions about how each of us has the responsibility to face the ethical and ecological problems of our lives on Earth. Now, this describes a process, if you like, this young man, who may be Nikolaj, in the fictionalized account of this book, describes a process of climate-related decisions and choices that he makes all the way through the book, before he comes to, well, we can't call it a solution, but a way of living. Nikolaj, that was a long introduction, but I really wanted people to get an idea, not just of what you are doing and think a little bit, but also what you've written, which is really a wonderful and very difficult book. I must say, I felt...
it's a terrible book.
I felt profoundly depressed afterwards.
Of course, but we need a language for that depression, so you're right about. That's what we're going to speak about. I have to say I'm a little bit sick. I'm very sick, actually.
And
I'll try to say
not just landsick, he is actually...
I have a good old cold, so to say. But
it must be a bit boring for you when you just have a cold, when you're dealing with such major...
Something so hot as climate change.
Such big...
There's also a problem that there's a translation. It's always difficult to do jokes when things are translated. I remember I was in a reading a couple of months ago, and then I had exactly spoken English, and the person had been translating it to German. And then one of my friends who had heard the German translation said that after I had made a certain joke, no matter if it was funny or not, then the German translator said that now he made a joke, and that is funny. So then you see. But again, it's all about translating certain affects, ideas, experiences into something that is bearable. Yes. So we are, let's say, even in the form of the event, touching upon the content. But yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. I hope I'll be able to say something relatively interesting about this depressing book.
And there may be a few laughs along the way, you never know. But I mean, seriously, because it is very serious, but you can handle this however you wish. I mean, what do you mean by land sickness?
Well, land sickness is a metaphor that I've stolen from nautical language, from nautical wordings. It's a term that sailors that have not been on the boat many times, have been on the sea many times, use to describe when you get off the boat and onto the land and you feel the land is shaking under your feet. And I use it, I took the metaphor, I thought it was too good to not use, to describe the double bouleversement, as they would say in French, the double shaking, the double movement of the planet and the human being at the same time. Of course, we all now know, no matter if we use the word Anthropocene, Capitalocene, new climatic regime, that we live in a world that is different. The world has simply turned into something different. What has it turned into? It's turned into a world that is reacting to how we are inhabiting it collectively. It's a world that is experiencing a loss of habitability. But of course, we're also experiencing ourselves as human beings, our very existential conditions change shape. So what I'm trying to exactly with that word is to capture this double movement, this double shaking. It's like an umbrella term, as you would say in sociology, that kind of tries to map the different affects, the fears, the grief, the anxiety, the confusion that comes from knowing that the world is denigrating inhabitability due to your own steps, due to your own species, due to your own mode of existence.
You know, I use that term eco-anxiety to begin with, and I know that it's thrown around these days, but I wondered what you understand under that term, and who you think are those people who are suffering from eco-anxiety. Is it just young people? Is it?
No, I think
what are the symptoms?
It's a generalized feeling. It's not that we all live with it all the time, but I think most of us have become hit by this realization that, again, we are not the same being as we were before. I mean, no matter if you walk through an airport or if you walk through a supermarket or if you walk through a clothing store, today you know that there is a set of destructive traces following after your very mode of being, your very mode of action. And I would never say that I feel like that all the time. You can't, of course, that's impossible. But sometimes we're hit by this feeling. It can be anxiety. Psychologists also speak about climate grief, climate depressions, and so on and so forth. But the most important thing for me to say is that all of these terms that we are now seeing floating through again, newspapers and so on and so forth, by commentators, are only a sign. It's a little indication of something a lot deeper, which is a fundamental, I would say, existential transformation of what it means to be a human being today. Mm-hmm. Of course, you're completely right about your indication that you see it often in the young generations, but at the same time, you see it in grandparents as well. You see it in generations in between the two and so on and so forth, to different degrees at different moments and so on and so forth. I'm pretty sure that in Valencia, in a couple of next years, you'll not only see young people being afraid about what the world has turned into due to our modes of organizing and producing and so on and so forth. So I would say that it's something that we have as a generalized affectual response to the world, but that it will only grow as we go on forward. I mean, we all know what happened in America the other day in terms of the election. There's absolutely no questions that these psycho-emotional, let's say, indications will grow in intensity and in scale. So yeah, I would say that it's a generalized condition that we sometimes all feel, not all the time, but to bigger and less degrees, so to say.
One of the many areas you describe is something you just alluded to, which is this generational difference, the way that different generations have either ignored or been unaware of climate change, the climate crisis, and then also how this growing awareness has impacted our younger generation today. And you do that by talking about your grandmother, or the grandmother in the book. Can you tell us what that particular generational
Well,
division is that you're describing?
It's a dangerous argument. People always understand it as if we should push our grandparents in the river Donau. That's not what I mean. Of course, no matter if you want to or not, we have to accept the fact that climate change has been a generational, let's say, exploitation, so to say. Certain generations were living off the habitability conditions, of the territorial conditions of existence of other generations. Of course, they didn't know the impact. Some did. Some decided to go on anyways, but no matter how we turn it around, then there has been certain, let's say, I would call them geo-historical elites, whose mode of existence, collectively, have denigrated the possibilities of life of younger generations. Of course, that's a division that we have to articulate, but my argumentation is not to declare war in between the different generations. My argumentation is simply that we have to have a language to this injustice in terms of time, or temporal injustice if you want to, exactly so we can create new alliances, exactly so we can do diplomacy, how to get out of this, hopefully together as many as possible. Because of course, when I'm saying that, when I speak about my grandmother, for example, the whole point is not to say, oh, you are an awful person. Individually, I suffer with her as much as I suffer. I feel bad for her as I feel for the young generation. Why?
So she realizes in speech marks what her generation has done in speech marks.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even put that in speech marks. She is realizing what they have done. Her political autobiography, she was after the Second World War, progress, growth, building a strong economy, all of those reasons that I'm able to speak English, by the way, because it made me an educational system and so on and so forth, unfortunately came with an unintended side consequence, side effect, that is the destabilization of the Earth system. Now, of course, it's a very tough realization at the very end of your life to see that you have to go in a different direction collectively. But it's even worse to realize that everything you fought for, everything that you thought your kids and their kids would take over with happiness and with prideness, everything that she was fighting to install, again, freedom, growth, development, is exactly what has trapped you on a planet, what has had the side consequence, at least, to trap your grandkids on a planet that is close to uninhabitable. And when I try to describe that, it's because I'm, of course, very interested in what are the effects of that situation. What are the griefs? What are the confusions? Imagine at the very end of your life to realize that everything you fought for has turned out not only to be not the direction that you have to go anymore, but it actually had a civilizational destructional effect. So when I say that I'm interested in the affectual level, it's of course also because I believe that it to a certain degree explains our way of looking the other direction. I think existentially that is almost too big of a depressing fact to deal with.
It's terribly difficult for me to, I mean, I could never confront my mother because it would destroy her.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. I think it destroys a lot of people, but we have to not necessarily...
Did you confront your grandmother?
Well, she read the book.
And what did she say?
She
said, Nikolaj, how could you?
What I write in the book is that we are experiencing her always growing very silent when we get to the topic of climate. And she's the smartest person I've ever met in my life. She knows everything. She reads everything. Very tough cookie of a lady. But every time on the question of the climate, she looks away. And I'm just trying to understand how come. And I completely do understand that if you have been fighting with pride for a certain civilizational political direction, and you realize that it again has trapped certain people, I think that's very tough at the end of your life. You thought you gave people freedom, and she did. She gave me freedom, but unfortunately we all have to now face the side consequences of that freedom that you won. So again, it's just one example of how we're on an individual and collective level, again, seeing a set of, I would say, ethical confusions, ethical dilemmas, moral transformations that I, of course, cannot give answers to, but I believe that I strongly believe that we have to find a language to describe, both in terms of theory and in terms of narrative, because it's a weird book. If you read it as a theory book, it's absolutely terrible. If you read it as a novel, it's even worse. It's kind of a hybrid in between.
He's selling it well.
I've received very little royalties for my books, so it's okay.
It's a rather... I've never read anything like it, I must admit, but I do think you try very hard to, as I said at the beginning, you're describing a series of choices that the narrator is making, and also a sequence of locations that he visits, which brings us, I suppose, also to the theme of this festival, the land. Then he crosses the water and goes to an island. So let's start in Paris. So you have the narrator in Paris, and he's trapped in a kind of prison of humidity and heat. The weather is so hot, it's so extreme outside, he can't escape. And he's describing his surroundings, everything around him. And then by the end of the novel, if we're going to call it that, you have come to a kind of renegotiation or a description of the situation. Before you describe, I think at one point, the billionaires going off into space to escape the destruction they've caused on Earth, or that we've caused on Earth. So, I mean, that's pretty much the arc of the story. But can you describe to us, and then perhaps you can give us a reading as well, these various starting points, if you like, why you started in Paris, why you then went to the island. I mean, you're looking at cities, you're looking at coastal life. These are different, each has a different problem.
Well, I would start out by saying why I decided to give a theory book a narrative shape, and then we can speak about the very mode of narration afterwards. I mean, there were kind of like three...
Could you give me the book a minute? I just want to get one thing
there were
when
kind of
you're
like
talking.
three reasons. First of all, I exactly wanted to pose the question of what the existential consequences on a level again of the condition of the human and the ethics, the confusion that comes with it, how that changes the very subjective life our life was today, which means that I had to kind of start from myself, right? And I had to find even another way of writing than when I write more serious theory books.
Can't find it.
Secondly, I strongly believe that the situation of the climate is not only a political crisis, it's not only a scientific crisis, it's not only an economic crisis, it's also, like I just spoke with a smart man down there about it, it's a crisis of sensibilities, it's a crisis of imagination. And in order to capture those those sensitivities, those sensibilities of the situation, I had to invent another language. I believe that we today need to put ways of writing science and literature a lot closer together, probably, to capture the situation. Why? Well, because we know the situation, but we don't feel it. We don't sense it. We don't emotionally fathom it. And of course, when you write in a certain way, then you not only are able to describe emotions, hopefully you might be also able to push them forward somehow. So that's why, again, I started from myself, my own experiences, and rightly enough, I did so by going back to Paris. It is based, I call it autoethnographic fiction, and people are always very angry at that term because they think it sounds like highbrow. But it's not a bad description because it is based on my own experiences over a couple of days, and then I've reconstructed it fictively. First, I was laying in an apartment in Paris. Almost every year now we have more and more extreme heat waves. 45 degrees in Paris is extremely hot because we all live in apartments under the roof if you're not rich, right? You're laying there, after 3 days of not being able to sleep, something happens to you, to your body. That's a tough situation. You read on your phone that it's 55 degrees in Pakistan. You might read on your phone what's going on in Valencia and so on and so forth. And then you realize that the only thing that allows you to sleep is the ventilator, the fan, that is actually causing the problems to be even bigger. So that kind of existential trap, so to say, I was very interested in finding the effects on it, because of course it's very tough to realize that there is a world that is heating, which will denigrate our possibilities of life. But it's even worse knowing that no matter what step you take yourself, no matter if you turn on the air condition or if you go and take a cold shower, you are making the problems even worse, right? That is the kind of anxiety attack I had myself there, even if I've been working on the questions of the climate for about 10 years and so on and so forth. That's what I said before. Sometimes now these situations hit you. The day after, I called up my friend, that's a true story as well. He said, come to my island, or not his island, I don't have that rich friends. He was, come to the island that him and his family on their boat were at. So I went down to an island called Porquerolles to escape the problems, so to say, for a little while. Of course, the first thing you realize is there's no outside to these problems that follow you in your footsteps, or even better, they are your footsteps. Because what happened, 10 minutes after I had put my feet on that beach, I was going for a walk by myself, there was an old woman who comes over to me, tears in her eyes almost, it's a true story, and she tells me, I'm sorry, but can you please find another place to be? Je suis Porquerolles, I'm from this island, I've lived here all my life, but there is no space left for me. Why? Well, because of mass tourism, first of all, and secondly, because actually the island is eroding because of climate change. Every year, the water is running out on the island. The mass tourists are making, let's say, the city completely polluted, the small city there, and so on and so forth. There's microbacterial disasters going on in the beach. You almost can't swim in the ocean because there is, again, ecological denigrating, say, traces that we all leave behind us. So I thought it was a very interesting narrative trope to go from Paris to an island. Why? Well, because of course also the island, the île, is isolation. It's this idea, it's a very good trope for thinking about freedom. You can escape. But today, John Donne once said that no man is an island, right? But today, not even an island is an island. You cannot even isolate the island from all the traces that are being left behind from how you run that island. So I thought it was a good narrative, so to say.
It's a very, very clever narrative, but it's also, it makes an enormous impact as well, because I come from a coastal area, I come from Cornwall, and for so long, for so many years, we've been talking about coastal erosion, and the cliffs have been, there's a cliff very close to where I was born, which has completely collapsed. And then, of course, the loss of biodiversity, bird life. There is a very famous Cornish bird called the Cornish chough, which has pretty much died out. And then you've got the pollution, rising sea levels, and so on, and the beaches. So all that plays into this, and it's a very thin book, actually, a very slim volume for something where there's so much impact and so much of a story there.
That's what Nietzsche always said, that big problems are like cold showers. You have to get in and out quickly.
You do it very well. But I like the way you compare yourself with Nietzsche. It's good.
Compare the argument.
Yes, with the argument, fair enough.
Of course we can compare.
I knew you wouldn't, generally. Now, so you go from Paris to this island. I think this is probably a good time to read the first section. The first section is partly in Paris.
Sure, but was it chapter 2?
Chapter 2, yeah.
Okay. I'll try. I'm not a real writer, as I say, so I'm not very good at these.
I don't know what people think are real writers. This is a book, and you've written it. And not only that, he's written it in English, which is so impressive.
Yeah. You should talk to my editor. They had a lot of problems with me. I barely recognize myself. The image of the human species seems to have transformed, and I'm mutating along with it. I feel this transformation every day, the change inside out, as most of my personal actions or habits mirror these global patterns. Like some planetary force-gen bargainer holed up in the dark of my bedroom, I am paying the ethical costs of my own affluence. Silently lying in bed, I hear the echoes of 1,000 remote voices. Almost no matter what I do, the extensions of my livelihood pull traces after me, leaving directly back to distant calamities. The material footprints of my life always situate me elsewhere, far away, most often a place where my presence is hazardous. I am here, there, and everywhere, and this is why the problems never disappear. A colleague recently found a way to frame this dispersion by distinguishing between the world I live in and the world I live off. My livelihood was always somewhere else, as the threads weaving my life together never failed to displace my being in this world. For me to live and thrive, I have to set foot on the lands of others. Yet, I do still not have a language to capture the experience of me breathing heavily in my bedroom while my boots are buried in someone else's livelihoods. In high school, I learned that when meeting a person, a bit of their destiny was in my hands. This is different. Now, what I do has effects in places where I've never been and probably never even thought of visiting. It concerns people I've never met and whose lives I can only vaguely imagine. However, there I am, in the midst of their livelihoods, affecting their possibility of eating, drinking, breathing, and living. All of it is due to my being, my freedom, and my own way of life. My life at the expense of theirs on a summer night during the heat wave. The temperature does not drop, but I feel frozen, fixed, immobile, afraid of my every movement. As I grope for solutions, it strikes me that if this is suffocating and confusing, it is probably because it reshuffles certain existential clues, forcing me to reconsider them anew. Shoulders hunched, I crawl out of bed and begin browsing my bookshelves until I find the book, then the page I was looking for. This is what I need, this is what I strive for. A man must first learn to know himself before knowing anything else. Not until he has inwardly understood himself and then sees the contours he is to take does life gain peace and meaning. Bewildered, I swiftly closed the book as if it has done me more harm than good, aware that I can never open it up again in the same way. Being Danish, I know this page of Kierkegaard by heart, since it used to offer me guidance when asking myself what something was and what it meant to be. Yet, tonight, it no longer resonates. Traveling deeply inwards does not assuage the dread and the anxiety that beset me, since these are chorused instead by the outward traces my being is left behind. It is as if my existence has flipped to the outside, and so I flip the pages in return. But in fact, nothing in this book equips me to frame, phrase, or fathom the contours of my own being. In the dark, my silhouette looks the same, but the shadows it casts are different. My very existence in the world has changed, and trying to reassemble its different pieces puzzles me, to say the least.
That's fine.
More? Or fine?
It's up to you. I mean, I know you're not feeling great, so...
Do you want more? Yeah. Yes, you would. God damn it. You can't say that in here. Sorry, that's not very good. If I cannot sleep, it is because I have been transformed into a weird monstrosity of a species that I do not particularly like, that my mind hectically tries to grasp, but I lack the words and expressions to understand. The insights from the existentialist tradition I was fond of as a teenager no longer hit this, but they fail to describe or explain the being I am tonight and will continue being tomorrow when the sun rises again. Well, existence probably still precedes essence, but this new existence is definitely another sort of being, one that is constantly fleeing home. It's not just that I exist for myself, as if I was lodging in some private hotel room full of mirrors. Rather, it seems that I exist from others like a spider in a web, sustaining myself by catching and feeding off them. As I weave my silken threads, my being and its trails constantly borrows from, overlaps with, and obstructs the continuous being of other beings. Some of them close, some of them far, some of them human, some of them non-human. Intermixti ergo sum, I mix and interfere, therefore I am and continue to be. I'm living in a doorless house, and beyond my exhausted limbs, my being extends, leaves traces, sets traps, and forms trails that other beings are forced to travel by. It is not merely that my existence unfolds as a continuous making of meaning, rather, it appears to fold as a process of negotiations between me, the entities that allows me to live, and the beings that my existence touches and is entangled with. Yes, if these walls could speak, they would probably tell me I've become a peculiar sort of broker, settling business where I have none, clinching deals where I should not, negotiating where I have no diplomatic rights. At least that's how it feels. My being may unravel as a construction of identity, but inseparably so from the destruction of another entity. I am earth, wind, fire, and water, perhaps, but I'm also soil depletion, hurricanes, wildfires, and sea pollution. The nausea that keeps me from falling asleep is not due to the eternal, inescapable depth of my freedom or endless corridors of my own subjectivity, but to the recurrent external traces in the world. Here lies my bad faith, not in social conformity or subjective inauthenticity, but in the immeasurable, destructive, social, and natural traces that my actions entail. This is what seems impossible to escape, not freedom as such, but the material costs of it. I think that's enough.
Thank you very much. So you can see it is.
You can see why it's depressing. It gets better. It gets more hopeful.
Well, talk about that. I mean, first of all, I mean, you take us to the depths of despair in that, because obviously the narrator, you went to such existential, dark places by realizing all these different aspects of what's happening to the planet. How do you emerge out of it? How do you deal with that knowledge? How do we deal with that knowledge?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Try answering it.
My first intuition would be that we have to create a language that allows us to understand what we have become, right? Instead of continuously...
Sorry to interrupt though. Do we need to accept responsibility? Do we need to blame somebody? Do we need to physically change, practically change?
Then I understand your question. I mean, this is an interesting one, because after I wrote this book, which came again after me and Bruno's book was written, which was about how we construct a strong political movement that fights for the conditions of habitability of the world, everybody was very angry at me because I go back to the subject, back to the individual, back to the questions of personal responsibility. And I was completely, even back to the question of shame, and guilt, which is people seem to be very afraid of, which is very interesting. I would say that this question is so big that we have to fight it on all fronts. We have to fight it collectively. Of course, I would never question that it is fundamentally a question of the political structures, how we organize our economy and so on and so forth, that we have to regulate markets, basically. But of course, there is also a question of individual responsibility, and I've never understood on a level of my own readings of social history that you have to choose. I mean, it's like I know sometimes I use the example, it's like walking around saying racism is structural, so therefore I can keep on using the N-word myself. Bah, of course. If something is structural, it's exactly why you also have to, from down below, in your own life, with your own life, change yourself. I mean, that's what the surrealists always understood, that Rimbaud's idea of you have to change your life and Marx's idea of you have to change the world. They can go hand in hand. If you read Norbert Elias, for example, on the civilization process, you always see that it's people's individual habits that is also making them form together a collective that can then go on to change the world. I don't believe in that distinction that we have to choose. I think it's a way of putting responsibility away, weirdly. It's like a Marxist walking around saying, I don't want to give money to the homeless persons because it's a structural capitalist exploitation system and so on and so forth. So that would be the first thing, that we have to face the question of personal responsibility, which means looking it in the eyes. I mean, Donna Haraway would have to say that we have to stay with the trouble, face it, look at it, describe it, immerse yourself in it exactly so you can be with it, and then maybe begin acting a little bit different. Now, I've often been, it's very 50-50 if people read it as a very hopeless book or as a very unhopeless, how do you say? The lack of hope.
Positive or...
But hope, what's the opposite of hope?
Full of hope.
Sure, but what's
hopeful?
Sure, but what is the opposite of hope?
Hopeless.
Sure, yeah. If people read it as very hopeful or very hopeless. I don't think necessarily it's a hopeful book, but I think it might be a soothing book. I think that it allows certain people to resituate themselves existentially. I mean, that's what I hope to do at least, and that's what I see, especially from the young readers who are writing me saying, thank you for putting my different confusions, my different bouleversements, my different, not depressions, but my different worries into a language that makes me able to resituate myself. I mean, sometimes hope is not about looking the other way from the disaster. Hope sometimes comes, if we still use that metaphor, by looking the situation in the eyes, facing this new existential situation and the earth, and then going on from there.
In fact, there was a really fantastic quote on, maybe it's on the back of the book even, which I wrote down because I really liked it, because it's how I felt after reading it. This person who obviously read and reviewed the book, she wrote, it's radically hopeful. And she said, here in our own personal darkness, and also in the pain of the world, we become honest. I think that pretty much describes what you're...
Who wrote that?
It's on the back of somebody who.
That's great.
Reviewed.
It's Louisa Neubauer, maybe. No?
I can't remember who it was, but there you are.
They should put that on.
One of your many fans. But I think it does describe how possibly you want us to feel after confronting this.
I think it allows for a certain, again, recalibration of our compass. If there is just a few tools in terms of concepts or in terms of descriptions of emotions or in terms of understanding, again, simply that your own being has changed into something else, then you can maybe go on. You can resituate yourself. You can map your existence in the landscape of the world a little bit differently. I think that's what we need right now. I think these questions are so confusing on our emotional landscapes, on our, existential landscapes in lack of better words. Imagine, I, myself, I'm not that old, right? But I grew up thinking that freedom was my per se definition of where I would be heading, both individually and collectively in life, right? I used to go through an airport thinking that I was adding perspective to the world. I was seeing more of the world. Today, you know that you're making the world shrink. It's just one example. There's a lot on freedom in the book. It's very technical and sometimes boring. But imagine that the very principle that we believe the most in is exactly what has trapped us. If that is not something you need to describe both on an effectual level and on a theoretical level in order to resituate yourself, then I don't know what the job of sociologists or philosophers are.
What is freedom for you today?
I mean, the first thing which is important about freedom is to understand, I would say, its complete emerging, or central location, and why we are finding this so difficult to understand, right? I mean, every time there is an ecologist opening his mouth, there is always somebody shouting, yeah, but you cannot take away my freedom, and so on and so forth. Freedom is, per definition, both individually and collectively, the principle of modernity, right? I mean, so my first argument would be that you can never do ecology without freedom. Freedom will always, the planet will always lose if you say it's at the expense of freedom. We are simply too politically, too collectively, too existentially, maybe even too aesthetically, psychologically at least, attached to this notion. It simply means too much for us. But freedom has luckily not only meant one thing in the history of ideas, it meant 1,000 different things. It meant something very different for an antique Greek guy than it did for an American in Texas. The German, Danish social state is built upon one concept of freedom that is social, while America is more or less a neoliberalized, radicalized idea about a certain Hobbesian freedom as the lack of constraints, right? Like a liberal concept of freedom. I would say that we today have to reinvent freedom to a certain negotiation or ethical engagement with the non-humans that we live among and that we depend on in our existence.
So by non-humans, you mean plants?
Yeah, the earthly conditions of our subsistence, the conditions of habitability. And that sounds very weird. But somebody like Hegel, for example, he believed that freedom had to be realized socially, in social relations to other human beings, through the social norms, through the Sittlichkeit, since we are in Germany. Or not in Germany, we are in Austria, but since we speak German, that would probably give me a lot of enemies in here, sorry. Sittlichkeit, through the social institutions. We simply have to expand that to non-humans. And of course, that's very problematic because it's very far from how we normally think about freedom, right? But instead of saying freedom is a lack of relations, you have to find freedom in the relations to what we, let's say, have as necessities for our continuous existence. Another way to turn it around is to say that what is freedom if you can't breathe? What is freedom if you can't drink the water? So my argument would be that it is very difficult for us to understand right now and to even feel, because freedom is not a thing, freedom is an experience, right? It's very far away, but we kind of begin to see that it maybe would be possible to reinvent our mode of experiencing this. We have no choice, so to say.
I mean, freedom has defined our lives, and however we want to look at the way that we're talking about it now is quite abstract.
Yeah.
So let's try to make it more concrete. If we think that, we've grown up, your generation, my mother's, your grandmother's, to think that, we have the freedom to own property, to own clothes, objects, land, to travel. We've defined our freedom in quite concrete ways, and you're suggesting another kind of freedom.
I'm suggesting what has been suggested several times through social history, which is that the liberal concept of freedom, be it either in a Hobbesian or a Lockean ideal of freedom as a lack of constraints, as an absence of constraints for action, is simply not allowing you on a collective level to realize that very same freedom. Right now, if you believe in freedom as a lack of constraints and travel, you end on Mars with Elon Musk. We've seen that the way that we've institutionalized, of course, you're completely right, that notion of freedom, of course, through markets and so on and so forth, more or less, very often not very regulated, has simply brought our Earth to a brink of destruction. But then we rethink it. I'm from Denmark, right?
Yep.
In Denmark, the way that we have institutionalized thought freedom was always through a communitarian socialist tradition of freedom having to be realized in between, through equality, through solidarity, again, through strong social norms that allows us to be together. It has been done several times, but of course I understand it is very abstract to imagine that we all of a sudden have to negotiate, that would be a good word, our freedom within the planetary boundaries. But go to a permaculture farm, for instance. I'm not imagining the whole world should turn into a permaculture farm, but when they are working not on, but with the land, they are explaining that they are experiencing a set of freedom because that the way that they are working with other human beings and other non-human beings, is exactly something that allows them to continuously subsist without destroying their own conditions of life.
Well, let's pick out of that then some more concrete examples of how you think we can live, because you mention closer relationship with non-human animals. In other words, we all need plants, animals. We need to live together more equally. We need to respect the non-human aspects of our territory that we live on. But are you also saying that, for instance, if we look at the theme of the whole festival, which is this divide between country and city, town and country, is one performing better than another?
On these terms?
Is the city better to live in today than the country or the islands that you mention?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, of course, that's dependent on each national context and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of urban ecology. There is a lot of very self-sustaining farms and so on and so forth. At the same time, at countryside, you also have farming that is very problematic. I'm from Denmark, in the way of exactly constructing a mode of production which is respectful to the planetary boundaries. So I wouldn't necessarily think so that there is one that is better than the other. No matter if you live here or there, you have to find a way, again, of settling. The question of, we spoke to an architect before, the question of habitability has come back. And that is a negotiative process that you have to completely reinvent for the very reason we don't know what an Earth system can do. We have no idea.
Well, let's talk about habitability and architecture, because that's your new.
I'm lucky enough that I've been given a job at a school where I will be assistant professor of a field that I know nothing about, which is architecture. But it's always very good to speak about things that you are newly to.
You're interested in those crossovers. You always have been. So how do you think that you might approach architecture?
Well, of course, I mean, one of the reasons why I chose a job there was because the classical universities these days are becoming, in my opinion, I'm afraid, sometimes run by factories. A lot of the people from my field in ecological thinking, they go towards design schools or art schools or architecture schools, simply because you have more freedom there freedom to write, to invent creatively, think. Now, architecture is, of course, as the gentleman down there can explain.
You're referring to my colleague from the UK, Rowan Moore, the architecture critic of The Observer. Yes.
Will be able to explain a lot better. The architecture is interesting because, of course, it has an enormous impact building in terms of the CO2 emissions of the world. I think it's something like 40% or something like that. And of course, architects have always been posing the question of habitability, right? Like But today they are having to find out that the way that we have been building, the way that we've been constructing habitability has ended up destroying our earthly habitability. So architects have to reinvent their own discipline, realizing that they are building on an earth that is reacting to how we're building on it, simply. Now, secondly, the reason why I'm very interested in architecture is because it strikes me as being in the very center of what I call geosocial class struggles. So, on class struggles, just a short theoretical parenthesis, if the old class struggle was a class struggle to take over the means of production in the Marxist tradition, or to keep the means of production, then what me and Bruno Latour argued is that there is a new class divide between those who wish to continue producing and those who wish to limit production. Climate activists, people who want to regulate farming and so on and so forth, exactly because they've realized that the reproduction of society is depending on such a regulation of production. Now, why do I find architecture interesting in that context? Well, because architecture, not least city development and so on and so forth, have always been taken place in the context of social struggles. But today, architecture have to realize that they are part and parcel of a new sort of class conflict, again, not between dividing the means of production or taking them over, but simply against if we should produce or if we shouldn't, how we should produce and how we shouldn't. I'm from Copenhagen, right, or I'm from Denmark. In my own hometown of Aarhus, there is an interesting, fascinating, huge scandal right now, which has actually caused the head of the mayor to fall. Not literally, but you see what I mean. He had to go out of office because they wanted to expand the industrial port down there. They wanted to rebuild the whole port. But at the very end, a lot of climate activists and so on and so forth went against that, and let's say cherished, exactly because of all the CO2, the pollution and so on and so forth it would bring in terms of biodiversity consequences. They fought against it. This is just one example. There's several of them of how architecture today is not only working in a context of a new kind of social struggles, but they're actually becoming main actors in it, so to say. I would say today that what we call the geosocial class struggle is exactly showing themselves in questions of building, how we build, if we should build, and if so, for whom we should build. Now, the third reason why I'm very interested in architecture is because, of course, all these questions of how we get that's where I started out, how we get the emotional responsiveness to this situation is necessarily also a question of aesthetics, right? Architects have always not only been just building the world, they've also always been somehow forwarding, questioning, proposing, imagining civilizational principles. They've given ethical ideals and values a certain shape. Plus, they've been extremely strong in creating concrete re-imaginations. And that's what I said in the very beginning. A crisis of imagination is probably what we find ourselves in, right? So the aesthetical potential also of architects to reimagine, resensitize us to a world that is shaking beneath it. That's why I'm very interested in that field.
I'd be very interested to hear what you conclude after spending some years or however long you intend to stay with architecture, because it'll be fascinating to hear what you personally take away from that. And I wonder, so far, how you say you've been dealing with this topic for about 10 years. How has it changed your life?
It's interesting to look at it, not how it's changed my life. Of course, I've changed my own mode of being, it's changed my own mode of thinking. But I think it's interesting to go 10 years back. Because what is so fascinating and tragical about ecology is how fast it's going and how little fast it's going at the same time. When I began working on these topics, people were saying, completely silly, you're a sociologist, you should deal with social norms or capitalism or gender or questions like that. Questions of the land, the soil, and so on and so forth, which have actually always been at a very fundament of social theory. They're not for you, blah, 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 blah. 3 years went, and then a certain little smart and important woman called Greta sat down. And more or less in the shape of a year, there was a generalized climate consciousness that had arrived. Bruno Latour used to always say that Greta was like Jeanne d'Arc. She was sent from God to declare war. And I think she's right. But of course, what happened after that was COVID. And COVID was very interesting. Because again, every time an ecologist has been opening his mouth the last 50 years, there's been an economist saying, but you cannot stop the economy. We have to keep on producing. But now we realize in 3 weeks exactly, because of the habitability questions of zoonoses, viruses, and so on and so forth, that we could stop the economy in a heartbeat. And of course, there's economical consequences, but not necessarily as hard as we maybe thought, that it would have been an even more interesting, even if there was certainly a lot of people close to me as well who felt awful during that period, then on a general level, many people were actually feeling better in a de-accelerated world. So why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning it because approximately 4 or 5 years ago, we had what I would call a climate momentum. First, we had of course, also because these dangers became closer in proximity, scale, and intensity, and so on and so forth. Now, every time we open our newspapers, there is a new climate catastrophe around. But Greta really changed things. With Louisa, the whole European youth movement, and so on and so forth, things began moving faster in terms of the international negotiations on the topic. There was really a lot of things that was happening. COVID, we thought we could use as a kind of a dress rehearsal, right? Like, we could use this mode of resituating ourselves. But then, of course, came the war of Ukraine. And we don't even have to speak about what happened last week in terms of Trump, which will, of course, mean that America will go out of the COP situation. So what I'm trying to say here is that the last 10 years have been very eventful. First, very much in the right direction, and then very little in the right direction. Of course, one can say that the question of Ukraine and Putin and so on and so forth has actually made us realize where our, let's say, energy dependencies are, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the question of production has been shut directly in because of war economies and so on and so forth. So it's tragic times in those ways, but that only makes our work sociologically, philosophically, I would say, even more important.
Normally, I would like to say I'm a pretty positive, optimistic person, and I normally try to end events on a positive note, but I'm not going to try this time because I don't think
but I'm a very positive person myself. No, but I am. It's always. No, but let's remember, there's different.
No, I'm not maintaining that you're a pessimist, but I do think that note that you ended on, the fact that we are confronting all these issues at the moment, and it is as though, if you like, the stars are aligned in some very negative constellation, and the election of Trump,
but at the same time,
being a pretty big blow, and Elon Musk entering the White House is not going to help anything.
He can be a baby by himself on Mars. That's completely fine. I think it's more important to remember that we have all kind of already changed world. We all know we live in another world, individually and collectively.
We're always going to be changing the world, though. The world doesn't stop changing.
Yeah, but like the amount, like if you look at it, the last 400 years, all political ethics have been geared, no matter if you're a socialist or a liberalist, towards production. And we've actually begun to understand that production might not help us reproduce. We've all changed on a collective level and even on an individual level. And sometimes we end our book, me and Bruno, by saying that I think it's a beautiful quote. If you look through history, sometimes the biggest changes in the world can happen as sudden as a sleeper changing over in bed. I'm not saying it will happen, but I'm saying it might.
You spoke about 10 years ago when you started off on this topic. What do you think will happen in the next 10 years? Where will you be in the next 10 years? When we sit here together, a little bit older, and I'm interviewing you in 10 years' time.
Next 10 years will be tough. Next 20 years will probably be tough. But I think after that, we will probably have begun to both individually, existentially, and collectively create the juridical, the political, the economical tools to deal with this situation. I remember speaking a lot to Bruno about that before he died. The next 20 years will probably be very tough. There'll be people, again, who take off to Mars or drill, baby drill, and so on and so forth. There'll be people looking the other direction. But we are going to change world. And even if truly enough that the Earth systems can, let's say, intensify each other's breakdowns and so on and so forth, we will probably at that moment have a better understanding of not only who we are individually and collectively again, but also where we are going, what a new horizon of history could look like. That's of course the very big problem today, that the ecologists have also been very bad at just saying, the world is ending. Nobody cares about the end of the world. You have to have a direction of civilization. You have to have an idea about the horizon of history, and so on and so forth. And I hope at that time that we've been better collectively at creating that, imagining that, visualizing that, and maybe even acting in that direction. That's what I would hope. Or else we'll all be living on the bottom of the sea. But there's different
or on Mars.
There's different ways to live in the ruins of capitalism.
Is that a positive note to end on? I think possibly. What an amazing conversation. What an honor to interview. Thank you to Nikolaj Schultz. Thank you so much.
Merci.